Welcome to EPG Padashala. I am Dr. Shamala, Assistant Professor in Philosophy, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Pioneer Regional Centre, Kerala. In this paper on Indian philosophy and religion, we will have a module on Sri Ramana Maharshi. The main points in this topic is we will have a brief look into the life of Sri Ramana Maharshi, and we will see Ramana Maharshi as a philosopher, and we will have a look into his technique of self-inquiry and his concept of reality, and finally his concept of liberation. As a beginning or introduction, we can say that in the Indian context, actually philosophy is taken to mean darshana, which means in Sanskrit seeing, vision or experience. In the philosophical sense, to see means to realize or to have a direct vision. That is why we call philosophy darshana. This direct vision is, of course, that differentiate Indian philosophy from the Western traditions. And this direct experience is the source from which all Indian thought flows, and it's accepted as the basis of philosophy in India. And it's from this standpoint we say that Indian philosophy is not merely a metaphysical speculation, but it is an immediate perception, actually. In Indian philosophy, concepts like God, soul, etc. are definitely experienced truth. And with regard to this rare experienced truth, which is not commonly possessed by all of us, during rare occasions, we find spiritually inspired people have appeared in the scene of India, that is throughout the history of India, to reveal this highest truth to us. And the saints and gurus, of course, through their spiritual message, have been the guiding force to the Indian culture. And Sri Ramana Maharshi, with whom we are dealing here, is one such person. As far as the philosophy of Ramana Maharshi is concerned, he is not definitely a systematic thinker or philosopher in the accepted sense of the term. And he did not present a well thought out system of principles. He believed that the thought must be eliminated, as he believed that it is through elimination of thought that one discovers the deeper awareness that is behind and beyond thought. You might be wondering, how is it possible? No. Yes, he said about this. Let us see what he said about this. Preoccupation with theory, doctrine and philosophy can actually be harmful insofar it distracts a man from the really important work of spiritual effort by offering an easier alternative, which is mere mental and which therefore cannot change his nature. This is what he had told about this process, because he says that all other things which we are dealing with are all mental processes, and he speaks of self actually. And he is a person who preferred to communicate through silence. We all wonder, how is it possible? No. And this power of silence in him was so deep and vibrant, as it successfully claimed the minds of many who were seekers of truth after him. According to him, we can again have a quotation of him. He said that Silence is never-ending speech. Silence is never-ending speech. Vocal speech obstructs the other speech of silence. And in silence, actually, one is in intimate contact with the surroundings. Silence is true exposition. It is perfect teaching or upadesha according to him. This is his opinion about silence, and that is why he preferred to communicate through the power of silence. He was of opinion that while teacher is employing words to convey something, just like me, when I am conveying to you about Ramana Maharshi's teaching, teacher is I am employing some words. So necessarily it implies dualities. Dualities of the teacher, the teaching and the thought. While Ramana's truth, his silence, was embodying pure, non-dual essence. Through this, he actually wanted to teach the ultimate doctrine of non-duality or Advaita. Advaita is called as non-dual, or Advaita doctrine is described as non-dual. We won't say it is in some other way, because when we say it is not one, we have something else in our mind. So it is best described as non-dual, or non-duality is somewhat similar to Advaita. And he did not propound, as I told you earlier, he did not propound any new theory. What he thought was the ultimate doctrine of non-duality, in which he found that all other doctrines were finally absorbed. All other doctrines were finally absorbed in Advaita. His teachings expounded the Vedic path of self-knowledge, and he taught it mainly through the tremendous power of spiritual silence. Guru is the bestower of silence who reveals the light of self-knowledge which shines the residual reality. So far, we discussed about, in brief, the philosophy of, or give a brief introduction to Ramana Maharshi, and now we will go on to his life sketch as the next part of this module. And his biographer, earliest biographer of Ramana Maharshi is B.V. Narasimha Swami. And according to him or others, we can say that Ramana Maharshi was born in 1879 in a village of Tiruchiri near Madurai in Tamil Nadu. He was the son of Sundaram Iyer and Alagammal, and his original name was Venkatraman. And in 1892, when his father died, the family moved to Madurai, where there was his paternal uncle. It was in 1895 actually when he came to know about Arunachala or Tiruvannamalai from one of his relatives, and on hearing upon it, it is said that some thrill went through his veins. You might be interested in knowing about one strange and wonderful experience he had. In 1896, while he was sitting alone in his room, all of a sudden he had a feeling that, or he had a fear of death which took hold of him. He thought that he was going to die, although he was in good health. You know what did he do? He became obsessed with this notion and immediately began to prepare for the coming event. He stretched his body upon the floor, fixed his limbs with rigidity of a corpse, closed his eyes and mouth, and finally held his breath. He realized that even when the body dies, the spirit transcends it, and the spirit cannot be touched by death. He realized himself as deathless spirit then. This is a strange experience Ramana had in 1896, and we find that he was completely changed after that. He realized that I is not the inert body, but the deathless spirit. And after this incident, he became very, very indifferent to all his surroundings, and his family members were really troubled to see all these change in him. And they gave him some treatment or something like that, and so he was fed up with all these things. So he left Madurai and reached Tiruvannamalai. On reaching Tiruvannamalai, he went straight to the temple, and when he stood there in the front of the deity, he experienced great ecstasy. For some days he stayed in the temple in deep contemplation. Later, to avoid the crowds, Ramana Maharshi moved to a nearby mango grove. Here, one of his devotees, Palaniswami, would bring him some books like Kaivalya Navanidam and Vasishtam. He used to read them. Later on, he moved from that mango grove to another place which is very close to the temple, a small temple actually, close to the large temple. In 1898, he made his first move onto Arunachala mountain. This Arunachala mountain is, what can I say, is a holy hill in South India actually. He made a first move onto the mountain, and the next 33 years he spent living in the caves up in the Arunachala hill. You can have a view of this Tiruvannamalai mountain in this picture. His mother came here by the time and begged him to come back home. But the sage, as it is said by his biographer, we can see that the sage wrote in Tamil that everything happened in accordance with one's karma, and so his mother had to go back without her son. The young saint would now spend next 23 years living in the caves of the Arunachala hills, and later he moved to the Virupaksha cave in 1899 and lived there for the next 17 years. Life in the caves continued as before, and most of the time he was found sitting in deep inner absorption. However, it was from this time that his life became more public oriented, and there was a select band of disciples who was earnestly following him, who formed a group around him. And it was they who asked questions regarding spiritual problems to him. And it was in connection to this, in 1903, we find that a Sanskrit scholar, Ganapati Shastri, came to Tiruvannamalai, who became famous as Ganapati Muni because of his severe austerities. And he visited the sage in 1907 and was elated with his teachings. He was deeply impressed by maharshi Ramana, sage Ramana, and he declared to his disciples that he could be called as maharshi or great sage because his teachings were really original. As far as we know, it was F.H. Humphrey who was the first European to meet Ramana Maharshi. Other foreigners who met him include Paul Brunton, Somerset Maugham. Somerset Maugham, we know that he was a great writer, Zimmer and Young. The British philosopher Paul Brunton is credited with 2 books which introduced Ramana Maharshi to the West. And you have a picture of him in the slide. And in 1916, Ramana Maharshi moved to Skandashrama. Here we find that his mother also joined him, and she was allowed to spend her last days with her son. Ramana accepted her as a member of the ashrama family, and she started cooking for the inmates. But in 1922, after 6 years, she passed away, and she was buried near Pallitirtham. In 1922, he shifted permanently to the proximity of his mother's shrine. This became a starting point to Sri Ramana Ashramam, and we see that Ramana Maharshi and his ashramam was developing around this samadhi. In 1947, Ramana Maharshi's health began to fail, and towards the end of 1948, a small module appeared below the elbow of his left arm, and it was diagnosed as sarcoma. But he was really least concerned about it. And on 14th April 1950, he breathed his last while his devotees were singing hymns of Arunachala. It was a rare experience which I would like to share with you, children. At the very moment of his death, a shooting star moved slowly across the sky and reached the summit of the holy hill, Arunachala. And it disappeared behind it. You can have a look into the samadhi of Ramana Maharshi in the picture given. Now we have had a brief look into the life sketch of Ramana Maharshi. Now I would like to look Ramana Maharshi or share with you some important aspects in the philosophy of Ramana Maharshi. As I told you earlier, he did not find any school of thought for his own. What he gave was the ageless truth of Advaita. I can say that to a great extent, more than an expounder of Advaita, he was a living embodiment of it. He demonstrated in his life the truth of Advaita and showed us through his life how is it possible for a sage to be in the world but not for it. It reminds me about the concept of Sthita Prajna in Gita. He was one with everything, free from all dualistic thoughts. So he has been after described as an incarnation of Advaita. As told earlier, Advaita means non-duality. And the essence of Advaita is the absolute is real, the absolute is real, and the individual human being and the self are not different. When asked if his teachings were similar to Shankaracharya, he replied, "My teachings are only an expression of my own experiences and realization. Others find it tallies with Sri Shankara's." Sri Ramana remarked that he had never heard or read scriptures before his great experience in 1896, and before that he had never heard of Brahman or Samsara. Later at Tiruvannamalai, when he listened to the sacred books or read with the books which he was supplied by his disciples, he found that these books were analyzing and naming, and these he had felt intuitively without analyze or name. The real purpose of philosophy, according to him, was to see was to serve knowledge to help sincere seeker to cross the boundary of superficial falsity of the world appearance to it. In Ramana Maharshi's view, preoccupation with doctrine and philosophy was actually detrimental to the seeker of truth. He gave us two reasons for that, and let us see what they are. Firstly, he said that the reality or truth of the universe is such that it cannot be comprehended by human mind. It can only be known through direct intuitive experience. That is the first reason. And secondly, if a person is preoccupied with doctrines and philosophical arguments, he will be distracted from seeking the truth through direct experience. So, Ramana Maharshi presents the seeker with simple, undiluted and authoritative exposition of his direct mystical insight into the nature of ultimate reality. This is a brief look into the philosophy of Ramana Maharshi, and now we will move on to his method of self-enquiry. In his technique of self-enquiry, Ramana Maharshi says that it is the human mind which is the main obstacle in our method of realizing the truth or reality. It must therefore be transcended as one has to arrive at truth. He said, realization is perfection. It cannot be comprehended by the mind. One must transcend the mind to be the self, which is absolute knowledge. The present knowledge, that's of the mind, is of limitation. The absolute knowledge, that's of the self, is unlimited. And he says that the mind has stolen us or deprived us of the awareness of the true nature of us and of the world. Maharshi's exposition is actually an insight into the reality and are closely linked with the practical spiritual discipline he can give us of self-enquiry. And according to him, the aim of self-enquiry is to discover by direct experience that mind is really non-existent. Self-enquiry is direct method, and all other methods practiced while retaining the ego consequently raises doubts about it. Self-enquiry, on the other hand, it leads directly to self-realization by removing all obstacles that make one think that self is not realized already. If we practice with single-minded resolve for self-realization, it leads one to secure for oneself the same mystic insight into the essential nature of the truth or absolute reality underlying the universe. We can say that Ramana Maharshi is unique in his method of self-enquiry, which is really easy and practical. There is no struggling with the mind and there is no suppression of thoughts in it. It is said that we can do this method while we are working with something else. We can do it while we are cooking, we are driving, or anything like that. We can go for this method of self-enquiry. And this makes it different from all other methods, and it's really differentiates it really from the meditation. Meditation requires an object to meditate on, whereas self-enquiry, there is only the subject and no object. Meditation, of course, makes the mind one-pointed, strengthens and increases the power of endurance, facilitating the attainment of perfection in the enquiry into the self. He explains that meditation is more or less mental, but the quest for the self is a direct method, and of course, it is superior to it. This is how he differentiates his method of self-inquiry from meditation. We people usually go for meditation and try to have an inquiry into the self, but Ramana Maharshi had a different opinion. He said, for the moment you get into the quest for the self and begin to go deeper, the real self is waiting there to receive you. And then whatever is to be done is done by something else, and you individual have no hand in it. Ramana Maharshi actually was living a life like that. While Ramana Maharshi authorized many different methods of spiritual practices, the one he considered as most effective was this method of self-inquiry. His method of self-inquiry is different from Advaitins, though not in all details, but certainly in its emphasis and understanding. The self is self-effulgent, which transcends darkness and light. One should not think that it is mind. The self is the pure reality. The ego springs from ignorance. It confuses and misleads man to think of self in the form of body, mind, etc. Maharshi suggested bhakti, jnana, yoga or dhyana to root out maya or illusion. And we can see that devotion in his philosophy meant aspiring towards a complete surrender of one's sense of individuality. And it is not mere adoration or service to God, because it involves a subject-object relationship. He explains that mind and ego are one and the same, and individual is nothing else than ego, which again is only the mind. And waking, dream, and deep sleeps are mere phases of the mind and not of the self. Self is the witness of these three states, and this is given in Advaita also. And here we can see the resemblance of the Advaita in his teaching. And he says, even though he doesn't say that self is a suction. Ramana Maharshi explains the spiritual heart as the true seat of consciousness, which is pure awareness or sense of being. He had found it from his own experience to be the center of spiritual awareness, and then found his experience confirmed in some ancient text. And since he was a practical, in order to end the miseries of the world, Ramana Maharshi suggested turning towards and seeking the self. He says that world and its sufferings are unreal. As long as one thinks that body or the objective world is real, there exists suffering. But once when we realize the self, there is no more pain, as self is reality, absolute, and is beyond all suffering. And this method of inquiry is beyond philosophy and psychology, for it is not the qualities of the ego that are sought, but the self-standing qualities. The spiritual discipline prescribed by him can be practiced by anyone, provided his or her present set of beliefs about the world are held merely as a thought view rather than a rigid dogma. And we can see that Maharshi's philosophy states our true nature is immortal, infinite, and perfect. And our sense of mortality, finiteness, and imperfection is a delusion born out of the identification with ego or the sense of individuality. He shows us a way whereby we can regain and abide in our true nature, existence, consciousness, and bliss, Sat, Chit, and Ananda. Such a philosophy has a greater appeal to us because it can provide greater hope and purpose to mankind than any worldview, and it provides a rational basis for regarding the transient ego as one's highest aim in life. So this is what I've got to tell you about the self-inquiry method of Ramana Maharshi. Now let us move on to his concept of reality or absolute. This concept of reality, as we have discussed earlier, he says that it's not he, a personal being, nor it is an impersonal concept. He said, Brahman, the reality, is pure spirit which is formless, unlimited, eternal, and without any differentiation. So it is permanent and the real, not transient and illusory. And he said that Brahman is the material cause which bring about an effect, the world of appearance, and that is not different from the cause. Brahman and world are a unity and they coexist as reality and appearance. The world is not essential truth, but merely the phenomenal truth of Brahman. Thus, Ramana regarded world as that which is a foundational to all experience, though it is no sense a substance. Having defined Brahman as the cause of the world, Ramana Maharshi defines absolute as pure existence, pure consciousness, and pure bliss. We can see that he defines reality by stating its essential nature or Sarupa Lakshana, and by stating its accidental attributes or Tadhastha Lakshana. But he preferred Sarupa Lakshana definition. He quite often spoke of reality as existence. He regarded existence or Sat as the real nature of reality. Reality is existence and existence is reality. Reality must always be real and it's not with forms and names. It transcends speech and is beyond the expressions, existence, non-existence, and so on. Here we see that Ramana Maharshi was fond of giving us an analogy of clay, which is given in Chandogya Upanishad, and he says that out of clay, potter makes so many things like pots, cups, plates, etc. Really speaking, all these objects are nothing but clay, but they are given by us various names individually. Each is in particular form has a name, but basically it is clay. So also reality appears in different forms and is called by various names. So Ramana held that the entire manifold universe is nothing but Brahman. And from the perspective of an ordinary person, there are three states of consciousness. Like Advaita Vedanta, Ramana Maharshi also believes a fourth state or Turiya, which is pure consciousness. And this underlies and permeates these three. He said, there is only one state, that is of consciousness or awareness or existence. The three states of waking, dreaming, and sleep cannot be real. They go beyond, and reality is always existing. Existence is consciousness, is the only reality. While the self reveals everything, it itself is not revealed to anything. And the self is never an object to anything. Self is called the knowing subject when it functions through mind. Fundamentally and primarily, the self is pure consciousness. And it's an expression of pure consciousness in a mental mode corresponding to an object. It is perfect bliss. And perfect peace is of the self. That alone exists, and this is consciousness. That which is called happiness. Here also we can see similarity between Advaita and Ramana's philosophy, and we find that self is described by Ramana as Sat, Chit and Ananda, or perfect bliss, consciousness, existence, consciousness and bliss. In one of his hymns to Arunachala, Ramana interpreted the three terms in the name of Aruna, which stands for existence, consciousness and bliss. Here we had a brief look into the concept of reality according to Ramana Maharshi, and now let us move on to the last part of the unit, and that is his concept on liberation. Ramana Maharshi advocated actually two paths of self-realization. Primarily that of self-enquiry, which we have dealt, and also of paths of self-surrender. He remarked, there are only two ways to conquer destiny or to be independent. One is to enquire who undergoes this destiny and discover that only ego is bound by it and not the self, and that the ego is non-existent. The other way is to kill the ego by completely surrendering ourselves to God. True surrender is love for God for the sake of love and for nothing else, not even for the sake of salvation. This is the way he describes about Bhakti Marga. This is his concept of Bhakti Marga. And Ramana Maharshi was not concerned about the meaning and nature of self-realization. Rather, he wanted people to make aware of the need to attain self-realization. He held that upon realization, all karmas are destroyed. And whether the physical body persists or not is of no consequence to the liberated individual. Ramana always stood for self and liberation have the same meaning. There is mukti and nothing else. According to Ramana Maharshi, bondage and liberation do not pertain to the self. It is only pertaining to the ego actually. And due to the ignorance of the self, sense of the self, or the I notion or the ego, which is superimposed on the not self, the three bodies, physical, subtle and casual. This is causal, this is bondage. To know this fact from a guru is the Sravana. Manana is a process of subtle inquiry and rejecting the three bodies, discovering the true self through self-inquiry. To fix the mind firmly in the heart to experience is called Nididhyasana or Atmanusandhana. And this, according to Ramana, is Bhakti, Yoga and Dhyana. And it was stated by T.M.P. Mahadevan, the philosopher. He said that the quintessence of Ramana's philosophy can be explained in 4 statements. Deham, the body. Naham, not I. Koham, who am I? And Soham, he I am. And this, we find the common factor I is a final truth. Hence, we can conclude that the tradition of Advaita has been reviewed from time to time by many sages and philosophers. Ramana Maharshi also revealed the light of Advaita once again to us. And here we have a look into the written works of Ramana Maharshi, that is Self-Inquiry or Vichara Sangraha, Who Am I? A Garland of Teachings, Quintessence of Teaching, 40 Verses of Reality, 5 Verses of 1 and 5 Hymns to Arunachala Panchagam. These are the written works, and here we have a picture of Sri Ramanasrama. Here we conclude the basic aspects in the philosophy of Ramana Maharshi. And to sum up, we can say that he was a great sage or philosopher who revived the philosophy of Advaita, and his speciality was his method of self-inquiry and also the method through which he suggested as the best method to convey his teaching, that is through the power of silence. Hope you had got a brief idea of the philosophy of Ramana Maharshi, and in detail you can go through the e-text. Thank you.